Convicted Epstein co-conspirator Ghislaine Maxwell is now appealing to the Supreme Court just days after sitting down with the DOJ. Maxwell's legal team argues that the government has a, quote, obligation to honor a non-prosecution agreement with Jeffrey Epstein that they say protects her from any criminal charges. This comes after just hours after President Trump maintained that he's allowed to pardon Maxwell, even though nobody's asked him about it. Take a listen.
Well, I'm allowed to give her a pardon, but nobody's approached me with it. Nobody's asked me about it. I never had the privilege of going to his island, and I did turn it down, but a lot of people in Palm Beach were invited to his island. In one of my very good moments, I turned it down. I didn't want to go to his island.
Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche met with Maxwell for 9 hours last week in Florida. Sources tell ABC News that she initiated the meetings and received limited immunity for the statements that she made. So for more on this, I want to bring in our congressional correspondent, Jay O'Brien, who covers Capitol Hill. And Jay, first, can you break down this appeal for us?
Yeah, so this is Ghislaine Maxwell and her attorneys going to the U.S. Supreme Court to essentially say that her conviction should be tossed out because she was covered, they argue, under a 2007 non-prosecution agreement that Jeffrey Epstein reached with the U.S. government and specifically the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Florida. The way that this agreement came together is that federal prosecutors, again, this is in 2005 to 6 to 2007, went to Jeffrey Epstein and said that if you pled guilty to state charges and you registered as a sex offender, the government would prosecute you for federal charges, and therefore they give him this non-prosecution agreement, which doesn't just name Jeffrey Epstein, but it also names alleged co-conspirators, both named and unnamed in this non-prosecution agreement. So what Ghislaine Maxwell says is, okay, that non-prosecution agreement that the government reached with Epstein in 2007 also applies to me. That's the argument she's giving to the United States Supreme Court. Now, what the federal government has said in the past is that because Ghislaine Maxwell wasn't a party to that agreement, firstly, it doesn't apply to her. And even if this agreement did apply to her, the argument they've made in the past is that because it was struck in Florida, in the Southern District of Florida, it doesn't apply to these charges that were brought against Jeffrey Epstein and ultimately Ghislaine Maxwell in 2019 and onward in New York, a different U.S. Attorney's Office. So that's what's no doubt going to be haggled in front of the United States Supreme Court if the Supreme Court ultimately does take this case, Alex, and it's still a big if.
Well, and Jay, Republican Thomas Massie and Democrat Ro Khanna are some of the loudest voices in Congress demanding transparency. Here's what they said yesterday on This Week. Take a listen.
I think we should get a lot more than just the book. Let's get the financial records of the estate. Follow the money. It's hard to believe that she herself and Epstein did these crimes by themselves, right?
Yeah.
So it's time to find out who else was involved.
I have skepticism, given she was indicted of perjury, given she has a motive for getting a pardon, and I'm concerned about restoring justice for the victims.
Well, and Jay, I think the big question here is, can Congress actually force the administration to do anything here?
They can if they passed legislation to this effect. And there's a bill, one is Ro Khanna's bill, one is Thomas Massie's bill, but they've said they would support one another as well, that would compel the release of the records that the Department of Justice has that relate to Jeffrey Epstein. And Thomas Massie will tell you that he's also got the buy-in from 12 or so hardline Republicans who have signed on as co-sponsors to his legislation. So ultimately, if this bill were to be pushed procedurally out onto the House floor for a vote, it could pass with a big chunk of Democrats and those 12 or so hardline Republicans. But I say, Alex, that it'd have to be pushed procedurally because Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican leadership who control the floor, have seemed to signal that they would not support putting this legislation on the floor because it would compel the administration to do something that Speaker Johnson argues the administration is already doing. Obviously, Thomas Massie doesn't buy into that argument. So what he and Ro Khanna would have to do is do something called a discharge petition, which would essentially force this bill onto the floor against the wishes of leadership. They would need the support of all House Democrats, and again, a pretty big, significant chunk of House Republicans to actually push this bill out onto the floor. And the quickest they could do that would be September, because the House is out on recess until the late summer.
Yeah, very interesting timeline there. Jay O'Brien, I appreciate that.